Hi there, and welcome to the online systematic mapping course. In this session, we're going to talk about systematic map reporting and thinking about all of the information that we should be reporting in our systematic map reports to ensure that all of the effort that we've put in is worth it, that systematic approach comes across as being transparent and reliable in the final document. So we'll talk briefly about what reporting standards are and how they relate to systematic maps and how they've been developed. We'll talk about what information we should be reporting in our systematic map documents and alongside them. And then we'll talk about some possible reporting formats that might work for you as you consider how to report your systematic map. So first of all, what are reporting standards and how do they relate to systematic maps? Well, reporting standards have been developed for the field of healthcare and systematic reviews for some time, and since 2009, this has been mainly set up as the PRISMA system. So this is a set of reporting guidelines for systematic reviews and for meta-analyses, primarily quantitative ones in the field of healthcare. In 2018, some ROSES reporting standards were developed in the field of environment, but largely relevant to any other field as well, with the aim of making those reporting standards more relevant to systematic mapping as an evidence synthesis method, and also for qualitative synthesis, so not focusing on meta-analysis and being relevant to systematic maps as well. It also tried to be more detailed and more stringent than the PRISMA reporting standards. And these have so far been endorsed or enforced by at least 3 journals: Environment International, Nature Climate Change, and Environmental Evidence. So now if you want to submit a systematic map to any of those journals, you'll be required to fill in reporting forms for both the protocol and for the final review or final map. But these forms have been designed that they help you to ensure that all of the relevant information is reported in your either map protocol or map final report. And one of the things that these forms provide is a template flow diagram that you can adapt. We talked about it before in synthesis, and you can fill in those numbers and show where studies have gone as they flow through your systematic map. And this is just a screenshot of a ROSES form for systematic maps. So each one of these rows gives you information about the kind of detail that you need to give and where you should put it. So these correspond to subsections and then section titles like the background section, maybe a subsection on stakeholder engagement that you can use as a template for subheadings within your systematic map. And it tells you the kind of information that you should ideally be reporting. So what information should we be reporting? Well, first of all, there are some useful resources that you can learn more about. This is only an overview and there's always more information out there. You can start off by reading some methodology guidelines for specifically systematic mapping and environmental sciences, but more broadly and relevant to lots of other fields as well. And you can check out some ROSES reporting standards if you want to learn more information about how those reporting standards were developed. The guidelines and standards for evidence synthesis and environmental management are produced by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence and give you detail about the kind of information that you should be reporting in your systematic reviews and systematic maps if you want to publish them with the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And the Environmental Evidence Journal website also gives some information about the kind of thing that they'll be expecting in any submission to that journal. But these are more broadly useful resources for anybody interested in developing a systematic map and submitting it to another journal, perhaps another field. But the systematic map report itself should include a background section, obviously. It should ideally have objectives that include the systematic map question, maybe some sub-questions if you have those secondary questions. The methods should have details of how you intend or you have searched for articles, including a section on screening and eligibility criteria. Within a systematic map, remember, we're not often doing critical appraisal or study validity assessment, but if you are, then that section should be very detailed. And where you're extracting metadata and coding studies, they should have detail on how that strategy was developed and why you're extracting the information you're extracting, and how you're also testing for consistency across the screening, study validity, and data coding and metadata extraction stages as relevant. And then any methods that you're using to map the evidence base, particularly including any visualizations that you intend to produce or that you have produced. So this is the same for a systematic map protocol in terms of the background, objectives, and methods. But for a systematic map report, the final report, you'd also have a results section with the descriptive statistics of the review, including the flow diagram, and then information about the quantity or quality of studies and type of studies relevant to your main systematic map question. You might also want a section on limitations of the systematic map. So talking about limitations of the methods that you've used. Perhaps you've only used a certain set of languages, or you feel that there might have been information held by industry that was difficult to get, for example. But you could also have a discussion of the limitations of the evidence base if you think that perhaps there's a certain area of the evidence base that's a bit deficient. And then a conclusions section as well should be in the systematic map, and this should have a discussion about the implications for policy and management, or perhaps policy and practice. And then you might also have some implications for research, particularly if you've made any observations about best practice or substandard practices in research methodology. And alongside your systematic map report, you'll want to produce a large number of supplementary files to ensure that you're being as transparent as possible. For one thing, within the systematic map report itself, you have to make sure that you link to the protocol. So you should start off the methods by saying that your systematic map has been undertaken according to an a priori method set out in a published protocol. And link to it there. That's so that people can establish whether you've done what you said you would do. You should also have details of how you developed your search strategy and how you tested it to see that it was comprehensive. You should keep detailed and provide detailed records of the searches, which search terms were used with which settings and limitations in which databases, and when those searches were undertaken. Where you've not been able to obtain articles to screen them at full text, you should report a list of those articles with reasons as to why you weren't able to retrieve them. So there we're really interested in whether that was an access issue. Perhaps your institution didn't subscribe to a particular journal or publisher, or whether you just couldn't find that record online. Perhaps the title had been translated, or there was a typographical error which meant you couldn't find it. And then for each stage of the screening process, it's really useful to have a list of articles with reasons as to why they were excluded. And often you would have just one reason. Maybe there were 3 reasons or 4 reasons that an article wasn't relevant, but you've only recorded one. That's fine as long as there is at least one reason that it shouldn't be in your systematic map. This is useful, as I say, at each stage, either title and abstract separately or together, and at full text. Often at title and abstract, you wouldn't really have a detailed reasoning behind excluding some of those articles, but where you do, that's important. Many of the collaborations, like the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, will ask, demand for a file that gives reasons for all articles that were read at full text and excluded. And then if you have a schema or a detailed plan as to how and what metadata you're extracting and how you go about coding, you should really provide that schema or that detailed plan as an additional file. And as we talked about before in many different sessions, that interactive systematic map database should be provided, ideally in an easily digestible format like a CSV or an XLS file. And then sometimes you might have some additional summary tables that were too large to fit into your systematic map document, and these can be additional narrative synthesis tables. And so finally, some formats that you might want to use. Well, we can talk about perhaps what might be best practices. If you're providing an interactive database, ideally this should be as machine readable as possible, or at the very least it should be filterable and searchable. You should use a consistent format throughout your database. We talked about the different types of database before, but you should either be wide, meaning that you have lots of columns and each variable, each level of each variable has a different column, or you should be long, where you have each different value for each study on a different line. You shouldn't combine them, so you shouldn't have some variables reported as multiple columns for each value of a variable and some as different lines. Try to be consistent, otherwise that's very confusing. It's also really worthwhile having a README. That might be a separate file, it might be a separate tab or a separate worksheet within the same document, but that README file should have full explanations of all columns and any naming conventions that you've used, so that someone can come along, look at that file and understand it without having to read the systematic map report in detail. That also helps people if they're going to be interrogating the database using a machine or using a program, so that they can really understand those naming conventions and call those values into their analysis easily. And it's useful just to think about running your software, running your database through some software just to error check. If you're going to provide a database that uses latitude and longitude, or that provides latitude and longitude, it's sensible just to run that through at least Google Maps. And if you have some studies that are showing up in an area where they shouldn't be showing up, it suggests you've got some mistakes in your latitude and longitude. And the same thing for checking whether there are any numerical values in a column that should all be qualitative information, and vice versa. It's useful if you're going to be providing narrative synthesis tables to think about these being human readable. So if you're providing tables that summarize information in an easily digestible format, and your database is either wide or long, you'll want to think about summarizing these in a condensed format. So just to remind you what we talked about in an earlier session, these are the three terms I've used there. The condensed format, which is the kind of table that you would have inside your systematic map. It's human readable, easy to use, but it's not machine readable or filterable very easily. Then you have a wide format where each column is a different value within a different variable, but each line is traditionally or typically a different study. And then the long format, which, like the wide format, is machine readable, but it's relatively hard to use. But it does maintain the linkages between different values in the same line. And one final thing to consider as a best practice, perhaps, is to consider having all of this information on a centralized data platform rather than relying on the additional files in a journal to be alongside your published paper, which are often not very accessible, not very obvious, not so easy to use. Consider having all of that information on a centralized data platform. One really great example here is the Evidence for Nature and People portal, www.natureandpeopleevidence.org. And if you store all of this information in one place, it makes it really easy for people to find it. And here's an example of a conservation and human well-being systematic map. And here there are lots of visualizations. You can download the data. You can find information about the project and find links to the protocol and the systematic map report. There's a glossary that explains all the different terms. And you could also have lots of supplementary information associated with your systematic map stored here as well. Another option is to provide your data in a data sharing platform like Figshare. This is an example from a systematic review, but In this case, every single study had its data tables extracted into a different Excel file, and all of the permutations to those data to get it into a format that was meta-analyzable were provided for each of those 303 different files. So if you are extracting complex information, if you're providing complex data in your systematic map, you obviously wouldn't extract study findings, but you might want to think about providing it in a really easily archivable and easily digestible format like one of these data management platforms. So in summary, we've talked about the fact that reporting standards help to ensure that all details are present in your report. We've described ROSE's reporting forms and that they were specifically developed for systematic map protocols and reports, and that they're the only reporting standards for evidence syntheses that are usable with systematic maps. We also talked about some useful resources for how to report information. And we talked about the need to make use of that supplementary information, and it comes back to this central tenet of transparency. We also talked about the ongoing need to think carefully about how to design and report your databases, whether they should be human readable or machine readable, wide, long, or condensed, or maybe a range combination of those. And we said that it's useful to consider storing all of that information on a centralized platform to make it really easy to find. Thanks very much.